There was a rumor in Harmon Creek that Cole Westbrook had a heart made of dry stone. Not cold, exactly. Not cruel. Just unmovable. The kind of man who'd tip his hat to a lady, hold a door without being asked, and still walk away from every dinner invitation, every introduction, every carefully arranged meeting that the good women of the county had spent weeks planning. He never explained himself. He never apologized. He simply said no, and the matter was closed. Now, and somehow that made the women want to try harder, and the men respect him more. Nobody in Harmon Creek could say with certainty what Cole Westbrook was waiting for. Some believed he wasn't waiting for anything at all. Some believed something had happened to him long before he settled in this town, something that had locked a door inside him that he had no intention of opening. But whatever the reason, by the time Cole was 34 years old, and he had turned down more women than most men had ever met, and he showed no signs of changing. What nobody expected, least of all Cole himself, was that the thing that would finally move him wouldn't come looking for him at all. Cole had built his ranch on the eastern edge of Harmon Creek over 7 years of quiet, deliberate work. The Double W, they called it, after the brand he pressed into his cattle. 2 interlocking W's that looked like a row of mountains against the morning sky. Yet he ran 400 head, employed 6 hands, and kept a clean ledger. He wasn't the richest man in the county, but he was among the most stable, and in a place like Harmon Creek, stability carried a weight that money sometimes didn't. People trusted Cole. They borrowed his tools and returned them. They asked his opinion on weather and land, and they listened when he answered. He was the kind of man a town leans on without quite realizing it, the kind that holds things together by simply being steady. But steadiness, as his mother used to say before she passed, could also be a wall a man hides behind. Cole rose before dawn, every morning without exception. He drank black coffee on the porch of the main house, watched the sky go from black to gray to the faint copper that meant the sun was thinking about arriving. And then he went to work. He didn't sit long. He didn't sit long for anything. Yeah, that was perhaps the truest thing about him. He was always moving towards something useful, always filling the hours with purpose, because a man who stayed busy didn't have to sit with the quieter questions. And Cole had learned somewhere in his early years that the quieter questions were the dangerous ones. His foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Earl Dobbs, had worked the Double W for 5 of those 7 years. Yet Earl was the only person on the ranch, possibly in the whole county, who could speak plainly to Cole without receiving a look that shut the conversation down. That was partly because Earl was smart enough to say things sideways, and partly because Cole, in his way, trusted Earl more than he trusted most. "Harmon's wife is trying again," Earl said one morning, not looking up from the fence post he was setting. "Got a niece coming in from Abilene. That word is she's educated." Cole drove a nail without breaking rhythm. "Word always is. This one teaches school. Good for the children." Earl smiled at the post. "You know, most men would at least ask what she looks like." "Most men," Cole said, "spend a lot of time on things that don't concern them." Earl let it go. He always let it go eventually. But there was something in the way Cole said it that morning, a fraction too quick, not a fraction too flat, that made Earl glance up just briefly before going back to his work. The woman named Silver arrived in Harmon Creek on a Wednesday in early October, which was neither a market day nor a Sunday, so there was no particular reason for people to be gathered in town. And yet somehow, by Thursday morning, half the county knew she had come. Her full name was Silver Thornwell. She had come not to visit anyone, and not to find anyone. She had come because her father, George Thornwell, had purchased a modest piece of land 6 miles south of town the previous spring, and he was getting too old to manage the move himself. Silver had come to manage it for him. She was 26, unmarried, and according to the few people who had already spoken with her, entirely unbothered by either of those facts. She was not the most striking woman anyone in Harmon Creek had ever seen. She was not the kind of woman who walked into a room and silenced it. She was something quieter than that, and in some ways harder to explain. She had dark eyes that paid attention to things most people didn't notice. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, she chose her words like she was spending something she didn't want to waste. She had a way of looking at a person that made them feel she was actually seeing them, not the version of them they put forward. And that could be either comforting or unsettling, depending on what a person had to hide. And she set up the Thornwell place efficiently and without complaint. She hired 2 local men to help with the fence line. She introduced herself to the neighbors who came to call, thanked them for the food they brought, and did not invite extended conversation. She was polite in a way that left no penning for pity, which confused the women of Harmon Creek more than almost anything else about her. Cole did not meet her that first week. He had no reason to go south, and he wasn't the sort to go calling on new arrivals. He heard her name mentioned twice, once by Earl, once by the dry goods owner when Cole came in for supplies, and both times he nodded and moved on. The first time Cole saw Silver Thornwell, he wasn't looking for her. It was a Friday, market morning, and Cole had ridden in to settle an account at the feed store. He tied his horse at the post outside and was crossing the street when he noticed a woman standing at the edge of the road, looking up at the roof of the general store with an expression of focused concentration, like she was solving a problem in her head. She had a folded paper in one hand and a pencil tucked behind her ear. She wasn't talking to anyone. She wasn't waiting for anyone. She was just thinking. Cole slowed without meaning to. It wasn't her appearance that made him slow. It was something harder to name. She looked like a person who was entirely comfortable being exactly where she was, at doing exactly what she was doing, with no concern at all for whether anyone was watching. In a town where most people were either performing something or avoiding something, that kind of stillness stood out. She must have felt his gaze, because she turned and looked directly at him. Cole expected the usual, the slight lift of interest, the small adjustment women sometimes made when they realized a man of his standing was looking their way. It didn't come, and she looked at him the way she'd been looking at the roof, evenly, curiously, like he was another thing she was trying to understand. Then she went back to her paper. Cole walked on. He completed his business at the feed store. He rode home. He told himself the encounter had been nothing, and he almost believed it, except that Earl noticed he was quiet at supper and didn't push, which somehow made it worse. They met properly 2 weeks later, and at the Harmon Harvest Gathering, a modest annual affair held in the field behind the church, where the whole county came together for an evening of food and music before winter set in. Cole came every year because it was expected, stayed 2 hours, and left before the dancing began. He'd done this so consistently that people had stopped asking him to stay longer. He was standing near the edge of the gathering, cup in hand, watching the fiddle player tune his strings. When someone stepped up beside him. Not close enough to be forward, just close enough to be present. "You play?" Silver Thornwell asked. Cole glanced at her. "No, neither do I," she said. "I always wanted to, never made the time." She said it simply, without regret, and without invitation for sympathy, just as an honest statement of fact. Cole wasn't sure what he had expected her to say, but it wasn't that. "You're the Thornwell girl," he said. "From south of town." "Woman," she said, and her tone wasn't sharp, just precise. "But yes." Cole felt something shift, very slightly, somewhere he couldn't point to. He looked at her sidelong. She was watching the fiddle player now, that same focused attention she'd had on the rooftop, like the music was a puzzle she was quietly working on. "I'm Cole Westbrook," he said. "I know," she said. "People have mentioned you." "What did they say?" She turned to look at him then, and there was something in the corner of her expression, not quite a smile, but close. "Yeah, that you're a hard man to know." Cole didn't answer right away. He looked back at the fiddle player. "They're not wrong," he said. Silver nodded once, like that confirmed something she had already suspected, and then she moved off toward the food table without ceremony, without looking back, without giving him a single reason to follow. And Cole stood there, cup in hand, watching her go. He stayed past the dancing that night. He couldn't have explained why to anyone who asked, and he left before speaking to her again. But as he rode home through the dark, the quiet that usually settled over him like something comfortable felt, for the first time in a long while, slightly less settled than before. Earl was still awake when Cole came in. The foreman looked up from his chair, read something in Cole's face that he chose not to name, and went back to his book. But he was smiling at the page, and Cole, passing through to his room, saw it and said nothing at all. Well, the next morning came the way all mornings did at the Double W, early, gray, and full of work. Cole poured his coffee. He stood on the porch. He watched the sky. But for the first time in as long as he could remember, the quiet didn't feel like enough. He didn't know what to do with that yet. He wasn't sure he wanted to find out. But something had shifted, something small and stubborn and entirely out of his control. And Cole Westbrook, who had never in his life let anything move him that he hadn't chosen, stood on that porch in the cold October morning and felt, without a single word for it, that something had already begun. Cole didn't go south the following week. He had reasons not to. Good ones. Practical ones. The kind a man could list if someone asked. The fence line on the north pasture needed attention. 2 of his hands were down with a fever that was moving through the bunkhouse. A buyer from Wichita was coming Thursday to look at a portion of the herd. There was always something at the Double W that needed doing, and Cole had spent 7 years making sure of it. He was not a man who ran out of reasons to stay busy, but he thought about her more than he would have admitted to anyone. Not in a dramatic way. Not the way the younger hands talked about women, loud and careless over supper. It was quieter than that. Well, more like the way a man notices a stone in his boot. Not painful exactly, just present. Just there. He'd be checking a water line or working figures in the ledger, and something would surface without invitation. The way she'd said, "woman," precise and unhurried. The way she'd looked at the fiddle player like she was listening with her whole self. The way she'd walked away without looking back, like she hadn't considered for a moment that he might want her to. Earl noticed. Earl always noticed. But he said nothing for 6 days, which was either patience or strategy, and with Earl it was hard to tell the difference. On the 7th day, he said, "Thornwell place got the fence finished." Cole looked up from the water trough he was inspecting. "That right. Heard she did most of the planning herself. Laid out the whole east line before the hired men even got there." Earl paused. "Somebody said she knows land pretty well for a woman who just arrived." "People pick things up," Cole said. Sure they do." Earl picked up his gloves from the fence rail. "Just mentioning it." Cole said nothing. Earl walked away, and Cole stood by the water trough for a moment longer than the trough required. He rode south on a Saturday. He told himself he was checking on a stretch of creek that ran along the county line, which was true enough. There had been some question about where the water ran after the dry spell in August. It was a reasonable thing to check. Or it happened to take him within a half mile of the Thornwell property. He did not plan to stop. He stopped. The Thornwell place was modest. A small house, a newer barn, a garden plot that had been recently turned for winter. The fence line Earl had mentioned was clean and straight. Better work than Cole had expected. He sat his horse at the edge of the road and looked at it for a moment, with the particular appreciation a man gives to a job. Done right. Silver was in the yard, and she was splitting wood, not struggling with it, working through it with a steady, practiced rhythm that said she had done this before and had no objection to doing it again. She hadn't seen him yet. He watched her set a log, bring the axe down clean, set another. There was something almost peaceful about it, the way she moved without wasted motion. He dismounted and walked toward the gate. She saw him when he was about 20 yards out. She straightened, rested the axe handle against her hip, and waited. Not with alarm. Not with particular pleasure. She just waited, the way a person does when they're comfortable enough in their own space that a visitor is neither a threat nor an event. "Mr. Westbrook," she said. "Miss Thornwell." He stopped at the gate. He didn't open it without being invited, which was a courtesy he'd always kept. "I was checking the creek line. Thought I'd see how the place was settling." She looked at him for a moment. "You thought you'd see how the place was settling," she repeated, not unkindly, but with a faint precision that suggested she heard the gap between what he'd said and why he'd actually come. Cole felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something close to being caught. "Come in if you like," she said, and turned back toward the house. "I'll put coffee on." The inside of the Thornwell house was spare and clean. A table, 4 chairs, and a shelf of books that Cole noticed immediately, more books than most households in the county kept. A small stove, a braided rug, 2 windows that let in good light. Nothing excessive, nothing missing. Silver set the coffee to boil and sat across from him at the table without fuss. She didn't fill the silence with small talk, which Cole found, to his surprise, comfortable rather than awkward. Most people filled silence like they were afraid of it, as Silver sat in it like it was a reasonable place to be. "Your father," Cole said. "He's not come yet?" "He'll come in spring," she said. "When the weather's easier on him. His joints don't manage cold travel well anymore." "So you're out here alone through winter?" "I've managed alone before," she said, without defensiveness. Just fact. Cole wrapped both hands around the coffee cup she'd set in front of him. It was good coffee, stronger than he'd expected. "The fence work is clean," he said. "East line especially." Something in her expression shifted, just slightly. Not vanity. More like the quiet acknowledgement of a person who works hard and doesn't often hear it noticed. "Thank you," she said. "I measured it twice. The first crew I hired was sloppy, so I let them go and found better." "You let them go yourself?" "It's my fence," she said, simply. Cole looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them looked away. And the strange thing was that it didn't feel like a contest. It felt like 2 people actually looking at each other, which was rarer than it ought to be. "People in town talk about you," he said. "I expect they do. They can't quite figure you out." Silver tilted her head slightly. "Can you?" Cole considered that honestly, which was not something he did with most questions people asked him. "No," he said. "Not yet." She nodded, like that was a fair answer. Or like "not yet" was something she respected more than a confident claim would have been. They talked for another hour, not about anything of great consequence. The land, the winter coming, a book on her shelf that Cole had read years ago and thought about mentioning twice before he mentioned it. She had opinions about it that were different from his, and said so without apology. He pushed back on one point. She held her ground on it, calmly, with a reason he hadn't considered. He thought about it, and he conceded the point. And she didn't make anything of the concession, which made him respect her more than if she had. When he stood to leave, she walked him to the gate. "You can check the creek line any time it needs checking," she said. He looked at her. The corner of her mouth moved. Just barely. He rode home with the feeling that he had lost some small part of an argument he hadn't known he was having with himself, and that losing it had felt strangely like relief. And he came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. Earl stopped mentioning it after the second time, which meant he had moved past curiosity into something quieter. The hands at the Double W noticed Cole's Saturday absences and drew their own conclusions, which they kept to themselves because Cole was still Cole, and there were limits to what a man felt comfortable saying out loud. The visits had no formal structure. Cole would arrive, Silver would put coffee on, and they would talk, and sometimes they walked the property. She was knowledgeable about land in ways that surprised him. She had grown up watching her father work it, had absorbed more than anyone had given her credit for. She asked good questions about his operation. She didn't ask them to flatter him. She asked them because she wanted to know the answers, and he could tell the difference. What he couldn't tell was what she thought of him. Not personally, and he could read her opinions clearly enough. She thought the county water board was poorly organized. She thought the dry goods prices were unreasonable. She thought the book they'd both read had a weak second half. But what she thought of him, of Cole Westbrook specifically, he could not get a clear read on. She was warm enough. She was engaged. But she held something back, and he couldn't determine whether it was caution or indifference. And the uncertainty unsettled him in a way he wasn't accustomed to. He had never in his life wondered what a woman thought of him, and genuinely not known. The answer, when it came sideways. It was the 5th Saturday. A cold had moved in from the north, and the sky was the flat white that meant snow before nightfall. Cole had almost not come. There was enough reason not to, weather-wise. But he had saddled up anyway and ridden south, and he was aware, as he did it, and that the excuses were getting thinner. Silver met him at the gate this time, which she hadn't done before. She was wearing a heavy coat and holding something. A folded letter. "This came Thursday," she said, holding it out. "I wasn't sure whether to send word." Cole took it. The return name on the envelope meant nothing to him at first, and then it did. It was a name from a long time ago. A name connected to a chapter of his life that he had closed carefully and did not open for anyone. But he looked up at her. "The postmaster gave it to me by mistake," she said. "Different road, similar name. I didn't open it." He looked at the letter in his hand. It was sealed. She had kept it sealed and returned it without asking a single question. And something about that, the simple, clean respect of it, moved through him like weather. "Thank you," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him for a moment with those dark, attentive eyes. And then she said, "Do carefully. You don't have to tell me anything about it." "I know," he said. "But if you ever wanted to," she said, "I'd listen." She said it the way she said most things, without pressure, without performance. Like an open door that had no intention of swinging shut on him either way. Cole stood at her gate in the cold, with an old letter in his hand and something loosening in his chest that had been knotted there so long he'd stopped noticing the weight of it. And he didn't say anything for a moment. The sky pressed down, flat and white, full of the snow it hadn't released yet. "Maybe sometime," he said finally. She nodded. "Coffee's on," she said, and went inside. Cole folded the letter into his coat pocket and followed her through the gate. And somewhere behind him, without ceremony, without anyone marking the moment. Something that had been closed for a very long time opened just enough to let the cold air in. That evening, riding home through the first thin fall of snow, Cole did something he hadn't done in years. He thought about the future. Not the ranch's future. Not the herd, or the ledger, or the spring buyers. His own future. What it might look like. What it might feel like to come home to something other than a quiet house and a foreman who read books by the fire and pretended not to notice things. The thought wasn't comfortable. He wasn't built for comfortable thoughts about himself. But it was there, and he couldn't push it back the way he once would have, and he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to. He got home. He unsaddled the horse. He went inside. Earl looked up from his book, looked at Cole's face, looked back at his book. "Snow's settling in," Earl said. "Yeah," Cole said. He hung up his coat. The letter was in the pocket. He didn't take it out. Not yet. But for the first time, the fact that it existed, that old, sealed piece of his past, felt less like a stone and more like something he might, one day soon, be ready to put down. The letter stayed in Cole's coat pocket for 11 days. He didn't hide it. He didn't burn it. He didn't move it to a drawer or box, or any of the places a man puts things he's trying to forget. He left it in the pocket of the coat he wore every morning to the porch, which meant he was aware of it constantly, a small, folded weight against his ribs every time he reached for his coffee cup. He told himself he was deciding when to read it. But the truth, if he was honest, was that he already knew what it said. He had known the moment he saw the name on the envelope. He just wasn't sure yet what he intended to do about it. Earl asked once, just once, on the third morning, indirect, as always. "Anything come up that needs handling?" he said, not looking at Cole. "Not yet," Cole said. Earl nodded and went to work, and the subject didn't come up again. The name on the letter was Robert Cobb, and Robert Cobb was the reason Cole Westbrook had come to Harmon Creek 7 years ago, and the reason he had never spoken seriously about a future with any woman since, and the reason there was a door in him that he had locked and plastered over and told himself, often enough that he'd nearly believed it, was no longer a door at all. Robert Cobb had been Cole's partner. 10 years ago, before the Double W, but before Harmon Creek, they had run a small cattle operation together in the hill country south of San Angelo. They had been young and capable, and full of the particular confidence that comes from not yet having failed at anything serious. They had shaken hands on equal terms and built something together, and Cole had trusted Robert Cobb the way a man only trusts someone once in his early life, completely, without the caution that experience teaches. What Robert had done with that trust wasn't something Cole had ever told anyone. Not the full shape of it. He had left San Angelo with enough to start over, which was more than some men got, and he had built something better than what he'd lost, which was also more than some men managed. But the cost of it hadn't been money. The cost of it had been the part of him that believed, without reservation, in another person. He had decided, quietly and without drama, that he would not pay that cost again. And he had kept that decision for 10 years, with the same steady discipline he kept everything else, until a woman at a harvest gathering had looked at him like a roof. She was trying to understand, and walked away without looking back. And somehow that had been enough to make the whole careful structure feel less permanent than he'd believed. He read the letter on the 12th day. He sat on the porch in the early morning dark, before the sky had decided what color it intended to be, and he opened it. His hands were steady. They were always steady. Robert Cobb was ill. Not dying, or at least the letter didn't claim dying, but ill enough that he had spent time thinking about old debts. And he wrote that he knew an apology was a small thing against what he'd done. He wrote that he wasn't asking for anything. He wrote that he had thought for years about sending this letter and had talked himself out of it each time, and that he was sending it now because he was tired of carrying the weight of the unsent version. Cole read it twice. He folded it. He sat with the folded letter and the cooling coffee and going slowly from black to gray. But he didn't feel what he might have expected to feel. There was no anger that surged up fresh. The anger had burned itself out years ago, the way fires do when there's nothing left to feed them. What he felt was something more like the particular exhaustion of a man who has been holding a defensive position for so long that he's forgotten what he was originally defending. He put the letter in the inside pocket of his vest, close to the chest, and went to work. But something had shifted, a something that had been waiting on the letter before it could move. He rode to the Thornwell place that afternoon. Not Saturday. A Wednesday, the middle of the week, no pretense of creek lines or neighborly calls. He rode south in the thin winter light and arrived at her gate at 2:30, and Silver was on the porch with a book when he came up the road. And she watched him come without surprise, like some part of her had been expecting him without knowing when. But he dismounted and stood at the gate. "I read the letter," he said. She closed the book. "Come in," she said. They sat at the table with the coffee she put on without asking, and Cole talked. Not easily. He was not a man built for easy talking about himself, but steadily, the way he did most things. He told her about San Angelo, about Robert Cobb, about what had happened and what it had cost him, and what decision he had made in the aftermath. He didn't dress it up, and he didn't minimize it. But he laid it out the way he would lay out figures in a ledger, accurately, without editorial. Silver listened. She did not interrupt. She did not reach across the table or make the soft sounds of sympathy that he had always found in other people, slightly unbearable. She just listened with her full attention, the way she listened to fiddle players and rooftops and everything else that interested her. And when he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he meant it?" she asked. "Want the letter?" Cole considered it honestly. "I think he's sick and tired," he said. "I think both of those things are true at the same time." She nodded slowly. "What will you do?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But I think I needed to say it out loud before I could figure that out." Silver looked at him steadily. "Why to me?" she asked. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Cole looked at his coffee cup for a moment. Then he looked up at her. "Because you said you'd listen," he said. "And I believed you." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved against the window with a low, steady sound. Silver held his gaze, and there was something in her expression that was neither pity nor admiration, but something more careful than both, like she was measuring the weight of what he'd just said and finding it honest. "I'm glad you came," she said simply. He came back Thursday and Friday. On Friday evening, he stayed past dark for the first time. Ed and Silver lit the lamp on the table, and they talked about things that had nothing to do with San Angelo or old letters, about her childhood in Abilene, about the way her father had taught her to read a piece of land by the color of its grass, about a winter she remembered that had buried the fences completely and left the world looking like a blank page. Cole listened the way she had listened to him. He asked questions. He found that he wanted to know the answers. Riding home that night, he realized he had not thought once about the letter or Robert Cobb or any of it. The whole evening had been entirely present tense. He couldn't remember the last time he had lived entirely in the present tense for 4 straight hours. He slept better than he had in months. Earl said nothing when Cole came to breakfast the next morning, but there was something in the old foreman's stillness that was different from his usual quiet, a kind of satisfied stillness, and like a man who has been proven right about something he'd been too wise to say out loud. "Don't," Cole said, pouring his coffee. "Wasn't going to," Earl said, entirely unconvincingly. Cole sat down across from him. He wrapped his hands around the cup. He looked at the table for a moment. "I'm going to ask her something," he said. Earl set his fork down very carefully. "Not yet," Cole said. "But soon." Earl picked his fork back up. "All right," he said. "I need to do it right," Cole said. I need to." He stopped. He wasn't entirely sure how to finish that sentence. He had never thought in terms of doing this right, because he had never thought he would be doing it at all. "You'll know how," Earl said quietly. No performance in it, just a plain statement from a man who had watched Cole Westbrook for 5 years and believed it. Cole nodded once. He drank his coffee. He went to work. But the work felt different that morning. Lighter somehow, without being less serious. But like a man who has been carrying a pack for so long that he's adjusted his whole posture to it, and then sets it down, and has to relearn what it feels like to stand straight. He asked her on a Tuesday, not a planned day, not a special occasion. The sky was the flat pewter of deep winter, and there was frost on the gate when he arrived, and Silver was in the barn doing something sensible with a length of rope when he came in out of the cold. She looked up. She looked at his face, and something in her expression shifted, that careful attention sharpening into something more personal. Cole stood in the barn doorway with his hat in his hands, which was not something he did habitually, and he said what he had come to say the way he said everything, directly, without decoration. "I'm not easy to know," he said. "I'm aware of that. I'm not quick to talk, and I'm not naturally open, and I have a history I'm still working out what to do with. I don't have a simple life to offer." Silver set the rope down slowly. "But I think," Cole said, "that you're the kind of person who doesn't want things made simple. I think you want them made honest." He paused. "I can do honest." The barn was very still. A horse shifted in its stall. The frost on the doorframe caught the gray light. "I'd like to marry you, Silver," he said, "if you'd consider it." She looked at him for a long moment, not making him wait. She wasn't the kind of woman who made men wait for sport. She was just making sure she was answering from the right place inside herself, which was the only place she ever answered from. "I've considered it," she said. Cole felt something move through him. Not a flood, nothing dramatic, something quiet and tidal, the way the biggest changes always feel when they're real. "And?" he said. "Yes," she said, simply, cleanly, like a well-laid fence line. He let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. He didn't cross the barn in 2 strides and sweep her up the way men did in stories. He walked to her steadily, and he took her hand, and he held it with both of his, the way a man holds something he intends to keep. She looked up at him. "I knew you'd come around," she said quietly. "Did you?" he said. "Well, you stayed past the dancing," she said. "That first night, I noticed." Cole felt something that in another man might have come out as a laugh. In Cole, it came out as a slow, rare smile, the kind that changed his whole face. "You didn't look like you noticed," he said. "I know," she said. And that, somehow, was entirely right. They married in the spring, just before her father arrived, though George Thornwell had written his blessing in a letter that Silver read aloud at the table one evening, and that Cole listened to with the particular dignity of a man receiving something he hadn't been certain he deserved. The ceremony was small. Earl stood beside Cole. Two women from town, who had become genuine friends to Silver, stood beside her. The Reverend kept it brief, which was what both of them had asked for. When it was done and the small gathering had moved to the table set outside in the new spring air, Earl shook Cole's hand and held it a moment longer than a handshake required. "Took you long enough?" Earl said. "I got here," Cole said. Earl nodded. "You did." The Double W ran the same after Silver came to it. The cattle were tended, the ledger was kept, the fence lines held. But the house was different. Not loud. Silver wasn't loud, and Cole hadn't changed his nature. But the quiet in the house was a different quality of quiet. Fuller, somehow. The kind that comes not from emptiness, but from two people who have found that they can be still together without it costing anything. Cole still rose before dawn. He still drank his coffee on the porch and watched the sky go from black to copper. But now, sometimes, Silver came and stood beside him. Not every morning, not out of obligation, but just when she wanted to, and they stood together in the cold, early air without needing to fill it, watching the light come up over the same land they now both called home. Robert Cobb received a short letter from Cole that spring. It said that he had read his letter and that he did not intend to carry the old weight any further. It said nothing more. It was enough. The door that had been closed for 10 years was not thrown open. It was simply, quietly, no longer locked. And Cole Westbrook, that who had once been the most immovable man in Harmon Creek, stood on his porch in the spring morning beside a woman who had never once tried to move him, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could honestly recall, entirely and without reservation at peace. Wherever you are in this world right now, whether you're watching from a small town, a busy city, or somewhere out in the open country under a wide sky, I'd genuinely love to know, that drop a comment and tell me what corner of the world this story has reached. It means more than you might think to know how far these tales travel. And if you have thoughts on how to make these stories better, something you'd like more of, something that could be stronger, please share it. This is built for you, and your voice shapes what comes next.